This is On Base, your one-stop shop for solving your most pressing B2B go-to-market challenges. Each week, hosts Chris Moody and Paul Gibson talk to sales and marketing leaders to get you in-depth insights and creative strategies to set your revenue teams up for success.
Hey everyone, welcome back to On Base. I'm your host, Chris Moody, and today I'm very excited to talk to Christopher Mael about aligning strategies across functions. Christopher, thanks for joining the show. I'd love for you to tell folks a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. My name is Christopher Mael, Director of Sales and Operations Planning for Precor, a subsidiary of Peloton in the fitness space. Prior to being here for the last 5 years, I worked for a technology company called Loud Technologies, which is a global leader in performance professional audio equipment, and was there for just over a dozen years.
Awesome. Well, I know when we talked on our prep call, you said something that caught my attention, making meetings the most enjoyable part of the month. So when talking about alignment meetings, bringing sales and marketing together, potentially ops, customer success, whoever it is, but I'd love to hear what inspired you to make alignment meetings the most enjoyable part of the month as a leader, and then how did you do it? How did you create that experience?
Well, I think it started out when originally our executive team meetings were a little bit like Thunderdome. I mean, it was Mad Max. Everybody was going after their own selfish KPIs or metrics that were driving their variable comp. And it was really a struggle to get any forward motion because those metrics were either adversarial or contrasting, and they weren't unified in their final goal. And so this was an area of the business that I was tasked with facilitating, is trying to find consensus. And yes, when the door shuts, we've all got to be able to speak from our diverse perspectives, but in the end, we have to have unified goals about how we get growth and in what way. And I think there was an inflection point where I was really excited. I mentioned to you before where one of our executives came in the room and clapped his hands together and said, "I'm so excited. It's my favorite meeting in the month." And I think that was a moment where I finally felt like we had achieved sort of the formula of getting people to be able to speak freely, respectfully, but at the same time hash through difficult topics. And that alignment enabled that company to do a full turnaround and get to double-digit EBIT in a very successful way.
I love that. The difficult topic, right? Going through difficult topics. Forecasting can sometimes be a difficult topic for folks. Sometimes people like to sandbag. Sometimes they're very transparent. How do you think sales and marketing teams can better collaborate on forecasting to plan for growth, especially when things may be uncertain?
This is a great question. I think, first off, a lot of times you get a hesitance or reluctance to participate, either because traditional methods are so quantitative. You have to have a data scientist to create an Excel model that nobody understands, or spend a lot of money in software, or have machine learning or AI, which are all great things. But the challenge is if you have all of that data and you don't have a forum to be able to steer the business, it doesn't enable leaders to feel like they can sit around the facts that have been found and make and place bets. There are tons of different quotes that you'll find from famous people talking about, your ability to identify risks and pick which risks you're going to pursue is super important and really key in developing growth where your leadership is all aligned on those growth strategies. I did make a note. JP Morgan Chase President and CEO Jamie Dimon said, companies that grow for the sake of growth or to expand into areas outside the core of their business strategy often stumble. But on the other hand, companies that build scale for the benefit of their customers or shareholders more often succeed over time. And so getting leadership, instead of trying to put a forecasting meeting like we talk about, that's just charts and graphs and all of this data. I think we all in the modern age suffer from our tendency to want to pick up our phone if we're not entranced by a topic. And that I heard recently the C-level executives have the attention span of a goldfish. It's just under 7 seconds. And whether that's true or not, I think as a culture, we have that truth where unless we have a question, something that we can engage in, something that challenges us, people get lost very quickly. So for me, the challenge in setting up this meetings is I have to start with the data We have to be able to come into the meetings with something really important. What products, what key accounts are growing? Are some things that we need to talk about? And then so many times people believe that they're aligned, and then they get in the room and they start facing some of those questions and they find out that they're very much not aligned.
Yeah, let's build on that one. I picked up a little bit of pain in your voice when you said that, some personal experience, but what are some practical tips for getting those different functions like sales, marketing, and supply chain on the same page around shared goals and expectations, whether that's setting shared goals and expectations or delivering against shared goals and expectations?
I think it's before that. It's creating the space for the conversations. Fundamentally, I think it's asking tough questions. One of my peers at the last company said, if we're unable to sit across the table and have an honest conversation about our challenges, we will never get better as a company. So it's less about tools. It's more about getting people together with a closed door and saying, all right, we're going to talk about tough things. Let's do it. And that means we'll have people who have very different perspectives. I'm going to get growth from my new product. I'm going to get growth from developing this key account. Okay, well, if your idea and your idea are different, are they both supported? Or is the operations point of view or RevOps is something completely different? Like they're stocking up on something else. So I think the most important piece is really just creating alignment of perception. And that's a success story. What does success look like for us? What are the areas that we need to improve? And how can we do that together so that it doesn't vilify an individual or create adversarial conversations?
Yeah, that brought to mind, I've had one leadership offsite before where we were all in the same location, staying in the same place, and there was a CMO who had someone tally up the number of times there was conflict, and we had to make sure we introduced conflict, to your point about great questions. And for many, I think there's the misconception that conflict can be unhealthy. Now there's a balance, right? But I'd love to get your stance on some of the building blocks for folks who may not be used to some of the tough questions, which could come across as putting them on the defensive, things like we know how people work. Any tips that you've seen for the best way to handle that or approach it in the meetings you've run?
First of all, this is fundamental communication. I had a situation where I was asked to go meet with a distributor who ran a formidable business in Indonesia. And I sat down with the CEO and asked him how he was doing with his business. And he said he felt like it wasn't performing well. And I asked him why. And some of the things that he told me indicated to me that there were areas of the business that were not performing well to his understanding. And I said, okay, now how often have you met with your people to talk about these specific topics? And he said, well, he hadn't. And I said, okay, how often do you have leadership meetings? He doesn't. Do you have any way to measure success or failure that are objective? No. All right. Well, clearly that was a gap, but it came from leadership down. So sometimes even leaders aren't aware of the challenges in their organization. And so we have to be able to come forth and put questions together that don't vilify an individual and aren't really painting people into corners so they go into Wolverine mode and they just start scratching other people and acting out. It has to be that they are not personal, right? But inclusive, and unfortunately that your word is probably used too much, but I think appealing to a different area, we know universities are taking diversity and combining it so that we can learn and grow together. And I think what these meetings need to be is just that.
Yeah, totally. And this is along the same line. Could be communications 101 type stuff too, but what tips or how do you like to approach building consensus when there are different priorities and metrics for success? So you talked about some very different teams. There can be geographic differences. We know that everyone's trying to hit the metrics that get them paid, right? Classic sales mentality, but we all should be thinking that way. But how do you approach consensus when things might be contentious?
Well, I think the first thing we have to start doing is we have to go to, whether it's you're owned by private equity or a board or you have a leader, wherever you are, you sit down and say, instead of me projecting what my values are and what I think success looks like, what do you want from me? How can we make this company better? And it's not just a you. What do you want? What does success look like for our owners and leadership? And building that out. So many times you can have a metric for an individual, and it may have been world class, whether it's an improvement of working capital or earnings, but you find out that the leadership had a totally different perception of what they wanted. They wanted to improve their inventory turns or the direct operating margin, where you were working on a different line of the P&L. Without having that conversation, sometimes people don't want to rip off the Band-Aid because they don't want to see what's underneath. And you just have to be willing to take the shots and say to the person who's the boss, what does success look like? And in that room, what do we all think success looks like? And we might find very different answers. And this isn't about success for an individual department. It has to start at the top. Like, is it revenue growth? Is it earnings growth? Is it new product design speed? Is it changing the way we house products, or whatever those are? Because then once you have that top view of success, then you can cascade down, okay, what are my action plans and milestones and goals I can set up so that we're on track with measurable things that are objective to show whether we're on pace for that or not.
Great answer there. And, one more question before we hit the lightning round with a few quick hitters to wrap up our time today. In your experience, what are some of the common misconceptions about alignment that may prevent teams from being on the same page, and how do you think those can be addressed? Yeah,
my first favorite misconception about alignment is that it exists. Most of the time you get into a meeting and people think they're all on the same page, and they might even be grumpy. Like, why are we even having this meeting? We all agree. Okay. And then we start with a statement. All right, this is what success looks like. Are we all in agreement? And sometimes people just will refuse to engage. They'll pick up their phone and they'll start talking. But if you add a little bit of meat onto the bones and content, say, okay, well, then that means we do this, this, and this. And then suddenly you get their attention. Oh, maybe I'm not aligned with that. So I think that's the biggest misconception, is that it's a thing. And most of the times when you start having a conversation and you ask those difficult questions, whatever they are, like, okay, then does that mean we're going to do this? Or does that mean that it will look like that? People will start having opinions about, as I internalize and digest that, maybe that's not what I think success comes from. So this oftentimes has to do with risk. It has to do with change management or timelines, where somebody might philosophically agree with, like, oh yeah, when it's done well, it looks like that. Okay, can you do that tomorrow? No. So sometimes it can be timelines. Sometimes it can be how reasonable those objectives are. Sales and marketing specifically oftentimes have challenges in getting alignment about what's our target market, what's our target product, and how are we running that innovation, and getting everything aligned is obviously a very challenging thing.
Absolutely. Okay, lightning round. We're going to go really quick on these. The first one, we like to call it Good Reads. Is there a book, blog, newsletter, or podcast that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I think there's 4. One, there's a book called Fundamentals of Demand Planning and Forecasting by Dr. Jane and Jack Maelhorn. That's a foundational piece. Demand Forecasting Best Practices by Nicholas Vandenput is excellent. The Journal of Business Forecasting has quarterly business reviews that are peer-reviewed. It's cutting-edge stuff, and it's from a variety of different perspectives. It's not just like a consultant who's trying to sell their wares, but there are people who are having transformational studies, and you might find one article that appeals to you and another that's irrelevant. So instead of having a big tome a book that feels like a textbook, a journal that you can use as continuing education can be refreshing, and it's not long reads. Lastly, there is a book called Demand Management Best Practices, Process Principles and Collaboration. That's by George Palmatier and Colleen Crum. George Palmatier is also affiliated with Oliver White, a major force in S&OP and IBP, which is Integrated Business Planning. I would just say that there's a variety of different levels. Some companies are at a high level, some are at a low level. And being able to get some of this information into people, and not just have it be like a soft art book, like, how do I talk? Okay, great. But no, how do I contextualize into my space? These types of books talk about collaboration at a leadership level in a very strong way.
Awesome recommendations there. And then we have a question called Good People. Who inspires you in the B2B space that you think would be a great guest on the show?
There's really one that comes to mind. His name is Tony Del Gianni. He was a senior vice president at Peloton. And personally, I learned so much from him. An ex-submarine captain in the Navy, as well as a business leader for major brands like JBL and Harman at Peloton. He's also very familiar with trying to create alignment at a leadership level. So he'd be the one person that would be my suggestion.
Perfect. And then the last and most important question, how can people get in touch with you after this podcast?
Sure. Anybody who has questions or wants to talk to me, I'm happy to talk with you. Just hit me up on my LinkedIn page and send me a message. And I tend to stay pretty well connected.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Christopher.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for On Base. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to share, rate, review, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This show is brought to you by Demandbase, the only account-based experience platform built for sales and marketing alignment.